And because I
There you go.
believe in the reliability of recording to the computer, I'm going to do that and share once again. Yep, it's actually four meetups: Portland, San Francisco Bay Area, and two new meetups, courtesy of Alicia Rock, Quorum, a virtual meetup for the Western U.S. and one for the Eastern U.S. Uh, I thank all the organizers and everybody from all the meetups for joining us. And I think this is like the fifth time we've done a proposal prep meetup for Portland, and they pushed me to bring it to a wider audience, and I'm glad for that. And once again, for the picture of the conference in 2019. And I say I hope because we haven't made anything official that we'll have a live in-person conference in 2022, but I'm confident and hopeful that we'll see each other again then in person. Of course, we'll see each other virtually. Just the basics. The deadline for proposals is the 25th of January. That's Monday night Pacific time, midnight. And a little bit on the process. All the proposals go before a committee of several people who've been part of the Right the Docs community. I'll show you a link to an example proposal with some of the highlights that we're looking for. And we have 5 people who volunteered to present or talk about their proposal, or is it 6 now? If you want to join the list, DM me in the chat, and hopefully I'll see it. But with 5 or 6, we have a pretty full deck, and just basically I'll give you 5 minutes to talk about your proposal, and then we'll do question and answer and or discussion for another 5 minutes each. In the past, for past Portland conferences at least, we've typically had over 100 proposals each, and that makes life difficult for a proposal committee who has to screen that out, review each proposal, and bring that down to, I forget, well, actually, it varies by conference. Sometimes it's 15, sometimes it's 17 speakers. How many proposals are we going to get for a virtual conference? I don't know. People are still experimenting with that. But for a proposal committee, it's like getting a ream of resumes, or I think the right analogy is more like college admissions committees, people who have to review all applications or all proposals. So what do you need? What do you need to do with a proposal? When there are so many, you've got to find a way to grab our attention. We've included a good amount of guidance in an example proposal, and I include the URL here. But just quickly, we have some highlights. We do look for catchy titles. We want something to catch the eye, not only of us, but of the attendee. Will they go to and visit your talk and listen in, or will they go to a non-conference session? We've seen many proposals that look like walls of text that make the old Windows blue screen of death look succinct. So keep your stories brief. I mean, I think proposals as another version of UI text. And you want lessons for your audience. Something an audience and the proposal committee can set up as a checklist. I mean, when people attend conferences, they spend money to attend conferences. They're expected to give reports. They want to be able to tell their bosses, well, at talk by this great person, I learned A, B, and C, and here are the lessons we can apply to our work. And when you have lessons, you have spoilers. You want to give people a taste of what they're going to learn. And and just in general, we want to avoid talks on specific tools. Yes, some people are interested in the latest version of Markdown, but I forget how many versions of Markdown there are. So I guess to repeat myself a little bit, here's the format I have in mind. And given that this is Zoom, if you have slides, you should be able to screen share them with us. And once you go over your proposal, some of us will have questions or ideas to help you improve what you have in mind. And with that, I'm going to present the first proposal because the person is unable to attend. They're in a time zone where it's, I think it's 2 in the morning for them. The proposer is Laura Novich, and she has a proposal going on community documentation. Her hook is to make a story, a talk that makes analogies to Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. And I hope you all can see this proposal and read it. It's probably a little small, but I'll describe some highlights as you look over it, and I'll open the floor for questions. Since this is recorded, I hope to be able to share this with Laura for feedback. Laura has experience with open source documentation communities, and full disclosure, we've worked together, not in the same company, but she actually teaches a technical writing course, and she set up a bunch of students to edit some of our documentation. Specifically, they took Veil, which is a grammar linter, found errors in our documentation, and use Git tools, learning them for the first time to fix errors in her documentation. Laura goes further, and I don't personally know of her experience with documentation communities, but evidently she has some and wants to make analogies to Willy Wonka and how different characters in Willy Wonka can serve as lessons for creating excellent documentation communities. And with that in mind, I'm going to see what y'all think, and open this up for discussion and ideas. How can this proposal be improved? The first thing I have in mind is, well, I mean, Willy Wonka is a pretty old story, and I'm not sure that the whole audience knows about the story. So maybe that can be clarified. And if you all have other ideas, please unmute yourself and speak up.
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
My question is, I'm not sure, is the presenter intending to be addressing, let's say, a docs team who is considering opening their documentation to public contribution?
The assumption is that it is, and there's a good portion of the Right Docs community that is open source and already has their documentation available for contributions. The question is, how do you build on that?
Oh, okay. So it's not about whether to just how to decide whether to open or not. It's about once your docs are open, how to handle the contributions, how to moderate, so to speak.
Yes, how to moderate, how to encourage people to make their contributions and continue making contributions. One of the big problems with open source communities is that almost everyone's a volunteer. They're not paid.
Right.
How do you say, hey, you're doing a good job, and encourage them to make more contributions?
Okay. All I would ask for then is a little extra piece of context setting before diving in, to say, like, this assumes that your docs are already open. Now let's talk about how to handle your community.
Excellent feedback.
Because to me, I was like, I don't know what, I was missing that piece of context, that's all.
No, thank you.
Liz,
Eh,
I have a
Liz,
comment.
can I follow up on that? Because it sounds as though you're like, if I read that first question,
Mhm.
um, that's really kind of where you're coming from, right? And it might be like, it's not clear to me which the answer is. Are you contemplating opening or are you already there? Right?
Good question,
So maybe,
Jennifer. Yes.
maybe even sort of, I mean, I'm taking Liz's question and building on it, right?
Yes, I
Um,
hear you.
Sort of context framing, you know, as broadly as possible and then narrowing down to the specifics.
Well, I actually want to add to that also, you know, because the title, I really like to have titles really describe what problem you're addressing in whatever you're presenting, or, you know, if you're writing. And so to me, it looks like documentation communities, golden ticket or bad nut. It's like, I'm assuming she's saying, oh, you're trying to decide whether you want to build a documentation community. So, you know, it really, and then she seems to be saying, well, here are tips, best practices, examples, and anecdotes. But that's like, you've already decided to build a documentation community, and here's what you should watch for. I'm like, no, I'm back with the title, and it's like, you know, in my own position, you know, I I I might actually, you know, be inviting people to help with documentation because there's some things open source that I'm working on, and so I want to know how to make those decisions. You know, it's like I want here to backpedal. Anyway, I hope I'm not going on too long.
No, this is great. Abbott, you're telling me that the title doesn't really express what the talk is about, and that goes along with some of the other feedback that says, is it really a decision on going open source or not, or what? How do you express that more clearly?
Mike, I have one more thing to add kind of in this thread that we're going through is that
Mhm.
I feel like there's open source that's like completely open source, like the Vue JS docs
Yes.
where nobody really owns them per se. It's all volunteers. And then there's like a company that has some open source tool that they make available. And so people can add PRs to the code and or documentation. And they're kind of two different things. And so I think if she could clarify which she's talking about and if she's experienced with both, if there's like things that she's wrestling with that could be different for either one, I think it could be interesting.
Well,
That makes great sense.
you have a secondary interesting take, which is at a previous company that I was at, that was a large company, we tried to help the customer success become a documentation community because they wanted to contribute to those types of documents. And so that would be another type of documentation community. And I think that this is intentionally a little bit vague. And I think it's because it becomes more encompassing of where you are. It could be that you are in an open source community and you're trying to help people contribute to the documentation aspect. It could be that you are in a large company and you're trying to align your company to be a part of the documentation community. It could be that you're open sourcing one aspect, really anything along those lines. And I think that's probably why it is framed more generically. Because all of this requires management, and it's all very sticky because you have to set a standard, and you know, it's, you enforce that differently depending on if somebody is an employee versus if somebody is contributing in open source. But regardless, you still need documentation. And from the open source perspective, the major decision factor for a lot of people using open source is the documentation.
Mhm.
And there's a tertiary thought about it is documentation hasn't been highlighted in open source always the same way that development is. And so, you know, there are places that are trying to highlight docs in accompaniment to open source projects as complementary, like Google Seasons of Docs, Good Doc Project, etc. Like they all have encouragement and programs to how do you get people just to come on and contribute to docs? Because most people don't have a problem getting folks to submit a PR for code. It's much harder to get people to actually write down what they've just created.
Absolutely. These are great points.
It does also mention teams inside and outside your organization in the top bullet.
It does.
There it is. We missed it.
It does, but Abby, that points to the difficulties of reviewing talks. You're reviewing this talk on the fly, and the comments are great, but sometimes the info is there.
So I have one more thing to add in this, is that this is such a broad topic that I think, you know, like what would interest me and what it seems like might interest other people that have spoken up is the second bullet point, procedures for recruiting new writers and bringing them up to speed.
Yep.
And see, this is like so broad. I don't see, if it's a half hour, I don't see how she can cover everything here.
Great.
So like the one bullet point that I think we all would agree, if we're you know, interested in documentation communities for open source, is how to recruit new writers and bring them up to speed.
On the same note, most of these dovetail into each other because you would need to give an example of how you make reviews feel welcome to contributors, and contributors are folks who have once been new writers. And so, and I think a lot of these things can be touched on in maybe 1 to 2 slides max. I think there's definitely probably like 3 top things, which would be procedures for recruiting, converting naysayers, and aligning the entire organization. Like 3 is generally your golden number. You can push 5 in a lot of cases, but I think you're right that there is too many. But I think it sounds as though, to me, she is writing out, you know, the kind of the example that goes along with the main point without highlighting the main point. And I think highlighting the main point is probably what comes next, is how do we focus into that? Because we know we're going to get examples. Like if you're recruiting for a new writer, you're going to have to onboard them to methods and tools, and you're going to have to give them good feedback to help them want to engage with the community. So like those would be 2 bullet points within that new writing thing.
Could I add something here?
Sure, Mo.
I see those multiple bullet points could also be viewed as, some could be process oriented, some could be culture specific. Like culture specific example would be converting naysayers into cheerleaders, and aligning an entire organization to think about and contribute to the documentation. That could be seen as ways to contribute to the documentation community culture, whereas the first bullet point, the methods and tools for collaboration and motivation with teams inside and outside the organization, I'm sorry, that should probably go under the culture as well. But so I see several things in there that belong under, okay, this is culture specific, and then there are other things that are that could probably be combined into higher topic bullet points. Okay.
To get to the magic 3. I hate to cut off conversation, but we do have 5 or 6 people who want to talk about the proposals. So I'm going to cut this off and go to proposal 2. And I see Brian Kerr, who is set up for proposal 2, is available. Brian, if you want to take the ball, great. I don't know if you have information that you can screen share or want to share or want to do things verbally. I'll leave that up to you.
I don't have anything kind of screen share ready, but I was just going to kind of go over kind of my talk proposal idea. and kind of just get feedback and see what everyone thinks. As a list here, my proposed talk idea is lift off how to make sure your documentation is ready for your next launch. Question is, I don't know if that's too wordy or not. But to give you some background, I work at a company that has a SaaS company that has an API-driven product. And earlier, I guess not earlier this year, but last year, we had a really big product release that kind of repositioned our product and what it can do and what our API is possible to do. And so that required a lot of help doc, API docs, and guide updating. And so we really had to kind of take a few steps back and figure out how we were going to work with our product team, our marketing team, and our support team to make sure that when this launch was successful, it was going to be seamless and not drive up more support, or it was going to be something that customers could actually use. And so my talk in general is going to or the proposal talk would be how we audited, organized, and prioritized which documentation needed updating and when, along with the product roadmap that was needing to be updated. So we built this thing called an Omni doc. So it was going to be kind of share what that is and how we organized all that information. How we worked with our marketing team to make sure that the language that we were using in our documentation was the same language they were going to be using when they launched, because we wanted to make sure that our help docs didn't say this is what this feature is called, and marketing was using different terminologies. So we wanted to make sure we were on the same page there. And then also how we worked with our support team as we went through betas and early access periods to take the feedback that they were getting in support and put that into our docs as well, so that I was answering questions ahead of time. And then kind of finally, another really big piece is how we were working with our product team to make sure that, as they were getting ready to launch things, we were staying up to date and kind of working in tandem. So, a lot of Jira work there, that type of thing. And so I think this is just really helpful for anyone that works at a SaaS company. And I guess to maybe some perspective to share as well, we are more of a self-service API. And so, our documentation is really our product, alongside our product. We don't really have a lot of high-touch customer experiences, so it's really important to kind of continue to make these seamless, to create a seamless launch so that we're not driving up all these customer conversations that we don't really have the person power to handle. So that's kind of the big abstract idea of my talk.
That's fantastic, Brian. What would you say are the lessons learned that people can learn from your experience? Or
yeah, that's a great question. I think probably the biggest lesson that I learned from that was just at every point in cross-team collaboration is, and making sure that you are, if it's the product team or marketing or support, making sure it's clear what is needed at what time, and kind of setting deadlines, that type of deal, so that everyone has set expectations, and also knowing that you're working towards a shared goal. I think that's sometimes lost when you're working at a company where it's it's the Dan Gable quote, you shoot, I win, I shoot, you win, that type of deal, where sometimes there's kind of some friction between maybe a product team or something like that, where you're saying, I need to know more about this part of how this feature is going to work so I can document it. But the understanding that we're doing this for the better good for ourselves to make life easier down the road. But that's a good question, because I realize I probably should kind of narrow down on that as well.
Great. Open discussion. Other questions?
Yeah, I just want to say, Brian, you really got my interest when you mentioned aligning terminology with marketing.
Yeah.
That is a huge thing for us. And I'm curious what the scale is of your team. Is it, and the other teams, small company scale or larger company scale, or?
Yeah, we're definitely smaller. We're about 33 people, and a handful of people in support and a handful of people in marketing. So I guess we are probably a little bit lucky in that regard. But we still are not the same people doing the same. We still do have these separate teams, so we still do need to work between them.
I think that's something you could usefully emphasize, the sort of collaborative, documentation as a piece of a collaborative launch readiness. I mean, that's what I heard you say initially. And
Mhm.
it seems like it's coming up more as you elaborate on your ideas. And
Mhm.
there have been some really well received, really successful talks where folks have talked about cross-functional collaboration. So you might want to think about really sort of foregrounding that. And that's kind of a follow-up to Tana's point, right, about sort of terminology. Not just, okay, we work with marketing, so we work with support, but here's exactly how we do it, and here's how it affects the documentation. And along the same lines, I think also, totally different direction, you might need to submit 2 proposals.
Yeah.
What you were sort of suggesting about better documentation, I'm translating, right? So stop me if I got this wrong, but I thought I heard you kind of moving in the direction of, well, better documentation for users means better documentation for our internal teams as they move forward on product development. If I didn't hear you say that, disregard.
No, that's a good point. For some of this, there were some internal documentation that I didn't. I mean, now that you say that, I even just think of like I was able to there was a new part of our API that we did, and I was able to go look at the documentation for like the raw spec that we made. So I was able to like really draw upon that to answer some questions before asking the product team things more specific. So
then you have almost like a closed communication loop there, which also sounds really cool. Now you've got 3 talks.
yes.
So I would like to insert just another thing that interested me in your description was that this is a self-service API. And even though like your title, I like your title, how to make sure your documentation is ready for your next feature launch. I would be even more drawn in, if there was some way you could rewrite that, because you're doing SaaS with with self-service APIs, and so it's really it's highly technical, and it's for an it's for an audience that is going to be relying solely on the documentation, which is different from what some audiences might be, because sometimes people still have to write good docs, but they're assuming that there's a sales engineer that's assisting certain kinds of customers. So this is a customer base that relies solely on your documentation in most cases.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, and that's going to be really, I mean, that's like so important. And so you were preparing for an important launch with a lot on the line, and the way that you succeeded was through this collaborative effort. And maybe you could find a way to even though that's not bad what you have, you might be able to find a way to reword it to include a couple more things that might draw people in even more, because they'll see the drama of the moment. I don't know exactly how to word it, but I'm just seeing the potential for really being drawn even more
Yeah,
into
that's a good
the
point.
idea. Yeah.
Make it a little bit more narrow focused.
Yeah.
Hi, this is Danny. I'm in quasi interrupting. I think you're at a pausing point, and my proposal is similar to this topic, so I'm not sure if it would make sense to segue after into something, because I have similarly amorphous project status.
Oh, I mean, I guess I sort of promised a certain order.
Okay, then never mind. Never mind. I came on late.
I'm happy to put you in number 6, I guess. I don't know if Rachel.
Oh no, that's fine.
Okay.
I apologize. I am on the road, and I was unable to make it home. So I was just jumping on, but I can just listen. Thanks.
Life happens. Thank you. Is there any more discussion on Brian's proposal? Well, now that we've had enough awkward silence for the end of
Thank
discussion,
you all for that.
let's go on to number 3 and Alicia Rock. She has an idea on how I can get started in open source as a technical writer.
All right, Mike, thank you so much. Would you be willing to let me share my screen? Would that be
Absolutely.
okay?
I'll stop
Okay.
sharing and
Okay.
you can take the
Little
ball.
bit of oh, thank you so much. Oh, it looks like a disabled participant screen sharing. So if you want to make me a co-host, that will allow me to have that.
Disabled participant screen sharing. Gosh.
Yeah, it says the host disabled it. But if you make me a co-host, I'll be able to present.
Let's see here. How do I do that?
So there's a little dot menu next to my box. You can click that and then do make co-host. If you're willing to share the power.
Yeah, I mean, I'm fine with that. The only option I have is to make host, which I'll happily do. You'll just have to make me host.
Okay, I will share it. It will transfer it back to you. Yep. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Okay. I promise I'll be a good steward. All right, so I'm Elisa Rock. I'm a technical writer for VMware, but in particular, I work on an open source project called Salt, which is one of the top 50 open source projects on GitHub. So, and I joined the technical writing subreddit a couple of months ago, and I found that 50% of the questions were, how can I break into this career? I'm either a new graduate and I want to become a technical writer, or I want to transition from a different profession into this. So that was the original context behind writing this blog post. It was because I was constantly typing out, come join open source and get some experience there. And so it was geared towards that audience. And one of the things I'd probably like feedback on is how to expand it to a Write the Docs audience. But so I usually start out in this blog entry by just talking about what's the basic pathway to getting a job. It's not always what some people intuitively think of when it comes to getting a job. I really like a really cool graph or diagram from What Color Is Your Parachute, where he talks about what job seekers think is the path to getting a job versus what people who are prospective employers think about how they want to hire somebody for a job. And one of the things that I think are particularly interesting is item number 2 and 3, where employers really prefer to have some sort of proof that you can do the job of some kind. And a lot of times they hire people who know somebody in the company or have some sort of connection to it. And the good news for prospective technical writers is open source basically takes care of those 2 elements in some ways. First off, by contributing to an open source community, you're developing proof that you can do technical writing. You're kind of developing that experience. If you're a seasoned technical writer, but you want to break into a new area of technical writing, or if you want to learn a new tool set that you haven't experienced with before, it will also give you experience with that because it gives you a reason to learn those tools. So it's kind of nice that way. And the other really nice benefit that people don't always think about when it comes to contributing to open source is that it can really expand your social network. Through contributing to to open source projects like I've done, because I don't just contribute to SALT, I also contribute to a project called the Good Docs, which is for technical writers who want to increase documentation in open source generally. You can really make some good friendships, and those friendships can sometimes be useful in getting a job. I've gotten a few job offers that I haven't taken, but through my open source connections and communities. So it's really handy that way. So it kind of does both. And the good news about open source is that you can make a meaningful contribution as a technical writer, absolutely, because there is a dearth of technical writers. And developers would love you to take their documentation tasks off their hands. They will gladly give you those tasks to do, and they would welcome you with open arms. And a lot of communities would just think that's the best thing ever. So it's a place where technical writers could really make a big difference. I do include a couple of caveats in my blog post. just because of the audience. I mentioned that experience can't always replace a college degree, and that's worth noting, but it can sure go a long way. And the other thing that I like to mention is that there are inequities when it comes to open source contributing. Unfortunately, open source communities are not as diverse or inclusive as I would like them to be. And so that's one of the things I really work on in my open source community work. But I just set those on the table just so people are aware of it sometimes. In the last part of my blog entry, I usually just kind of give tips of how to choose the right project, because not all communities are a good fit for you. So you have to really do some research and digging to find out if it's the right kind of fit for what you want to learn, what your interests are, what your existing skill set is. So you want to kind of do some soul searching when you do that sort of thing. And then when you're preparing to give your first contribution, you really want to kind of learn more about the community that you're thinking about joining. You want to read their community docs. You want to maybe join a few working groups and see if it's the kind of place where you feel like you might fit in. And check out their code of conduct. If they have a good code of conduct, does it feel like it'll be a safe and welcoming place for different people? All of those things are important to do, just to make sure it's a healthy community and one where you feel like you could be at home with. And then, of course, there's the tool set. You have to have a code editor. It's really helpful to know Markdown. Most documentation in open source is written in Markdown, in my experience at least. You really need to learn about Git. That's scary and it's not fun, but it's like driving a stick shift where it's really hard. It's so hard to get there, but once you do, you just feel awesome and you can do so much and it's so powerful. Does that date me to say stick shift? I don't know. And then I just give a bunch of other tips about how to, learn about Git and how to find the right community for you and things like that. So that would be basically the tenor of the talk. So the kind of feedback I'd love to see is how to improve the title and to make the hook a little bit better, how to modify this material to expand it to a Write the Docs audience, which maybe not everybody is looking for a new job or trying to transition into technical writing. And any other feedback you'd like to give, I welcome that feedback. So.
Gosh, I see 6 different presentations in there, and it looks like a very impressive book. But when you present it as a proposal, you need something that people or reviewers can digest quickly. And
yep, sounds good.
Maybe others can help Alicia with that.
Can you remind us what the title was, Elisa?
Yes, it was just a very basic getting started in open source as a new technical writer. That was all it was. So.
As we're noodling on the title, one thing, since you asked about the question for making it more to the Write the Docs audience, I think it could be really simple, something like a sense like whether you're looking for your first job or your next job or just want to get more experience, could make it more universal.
Right, I was going to say you could take new out of the title because I would be interested. I mean, it's always good to make connections, right? Especially if you're trying to move to a different role or a different company, whatnot.
Yeah, could see that. I like that.
I think that's
really
a
liked
good point, but I want to follow up on it because something that occurred to me, and this is probably inviting, like, okay, talk number 4 here, but might intersect with what you wind up actually proposing. So I think you make some really good points about paying attention to the communities of the projects you're considering to contribute to. But many of the open source projects that need documentation help the most don't even have that basic structure in place. They've barely got a README. They often just fold some really basic contributing information into the README. There's no code of conduct, not because the community sucks, although it might well, right? But I mean, especially on a small project that seems to be gaining momentum and to really need some documentation help, they might well not have got to it yet. I mean, that might, like, so this is riffing on the, sort of new writers versus sort of further down the road. Like a lot's going to depend on your tolerance for ambiguity and confusion. A really well-established project, you know, the Kubernetes docs would dearly love to see technical writers, but there is all the structure and community in the world anybody could possibly want, or, you know, for a technical writer to step in there. Whereas some of the smaller projects that I've seen are just kind of limping along docs-wise, could really use somebody, but you really kind of have to reinvent it from the ground up. That really is a whole nother talk, but it feels like there's a piece in there that touches on what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Maybe if nothing else, then just to like, if what you want to do is address folks new to open source, point out that there's a huge range, right? There's a huge range of possibilities, and then the criteria that you, I think, really rightly identify as things to look out for if you're looking for a first-time project, are things that are going to be characteristic of larger projects that are still going to need your help, right? Sorry, I'm kind of thinking out loud at you, but
no, those are such good points, and they're really important to note. Even if I don't like make this proposal, just like adding to the blog entry or adding those kinds of caveats would be really good. And to your point, that's a lot of what we're trying to do at the Good Docs, is to improve like that base template or base documentation line in many ways. So I love it. That's great.
Yeah, I feel bad. I was involved with that project at the very beginning and then got overloaded.
Oh, that's right. Okay, yeah. Very good.
Hey,
it's all good.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but people can submit more than one idea to the proposal submission. Is that true?
That's true. Typically, well, we've had multiple submissions from the same people. We've never, at least to my knowledge, accepted more than one from the same person.
Yes. And that I would assume, but more so, you know, we've had a lot of discussions that have kind of broken down things into more than one presentation. And so if you want to do the work, totally up to you. You can submit more than one. And also remember, you don't have to have your talk fully written before you submit something. So you can just abstract away, as they say.
Yeah, and one other thing, I just noticing in the Zoom group chat that Jerome, I don't know if you want to verbalize your suggestion, but he seems to have a great suggestion for a talk title.
Sure, yeah. Open source opens doors.
I like it. That's really good.
Yeah, and then
there was
this
another
also
one, right?
Fits right into like what I've done. I'm a newer technical writer, and I've done Google Season of Docs, and I'm working with the open source gig. So this is right up my alley. Thank you.
Yep, and the second suggestion from Danny, I don't know if you want to verbalize. I guess Danny's not able to unmute, so I'll just say her suggestion was technically employed.
There, just so you're aware.
They're driving.
Ah, right, okay.
Not driving at the moment, but sorry about that. Yeah, they, them, and it's fine. It was just a suggestion, so I like it. I like it too. Oh, thanks. That's kind. Well, that's really helpful. Thank you so much, everybody.
And that seems like a natural end of discussion to what Alicia has done, and I guess I can, if I can find the Zoom controls.
And I think I made you the host again. Did that work?
Share my screen. It looks like I'm able to do that. So I will slide off to proposal 4, Kimberly Johnson. If you have slides, I'm happy to make you the host.
Thank you so much. I don't have slides, but I do have an abstract written that it might be helpful for me to just put up on the screen, if it's okay for me to share my screen.
Oh, absolutely.
It looks like my button is illuminated. Oh, no, disabled participant screen sharing. So if you wouldn't mind, I will try to be as good of a steward as it was.
You should have access now.
Okay, it looks like I have that notification. Let me go ahead and share desktop 2. Let's see if it'll let me allow Zoom. Oh no, I haven't allowed Zoom to share my screen yet because I actually work at a video API company. So we build our own products, experiment a lot. And let's see if this will turn on really quickly. And if not, okay, I should be good. But okay, you know what, that's not working, but I can talk through it instead. So I think everyone was able to see that the idea for the talk was that talks are products too, and they should grow and evolve with your business. So what happened was I mentioned I work for a video API company. We actually pivoted to focus on software from being a hardware company in 2019. And then a year later, a lot more developers than we expected found themselves Googling how to add video to my application. So that meant we had to look at revising our docs because we outgrew them a lot more quickly than we expected. Specifically, our getting started guide really needed a refresh. So there was that intersection of the lots of people adopting our product unexpectedly, global circumstances changing, leading to that. So I was thinking that was something that a lot of companies might encounter or be dealing with, or a product focus at the company. Like I mentioned, we switched from software to hardware. So those were the two things I was thinking might be common challenges. So this talk will talk through how we shipped a new getting started page in just a few weeks. And the three main takeaways I have for now are how we mapped our customers' experiences from their first interaction to testing to a custom integration to inform our new information architecture for getting started. That's number one. Number two is how we leaned on our core company metrics to think of our revision as its own product, kind of like Brian was saying earlier, like the docs are a product too. And the final thing is how we identified what was important, but now kind of extraneous information, and how we found that a new home that wasn't necessarily our getting started guide. That's the high level summary. And my main questions for the Write the Docs community are, what could we add or take away that would increase your interest in a talk like that? What do you think would make a talk like that more memorable? And when talking about these sorts of improvements in smaller companies, we're a team of 10 when I joined and maybe 20, 25 now. How important are the specifics and qualitative metrics? And any other thoughts you might have, of course, welcome to.
I think people are always hungry for how other people set up metrics and how to collect them. That's just always a topic of conversation I'll have in the hallway track with regards to just interacting with folks casually at the event. Even the virtual hallway track that we set up using the sessions for last year. And so like, I wouldn't say you need to like go into an in-depth implementation of it, but like I would be prepared for, at the very least, a lot of follow-up questions about it, because that's a huge area of curiosity for a lot of people, because doc metrics are different than, you know, page touches and the marketing funnel and, you know, how people interact with the product, because it sits, you know, uniquely as its own product to an extent, but also as a service to both folks in and outside of the company. So.
Thank you, that's really helpful.
Kimberly, I just wanted to say I always like the talks that are like a case study. So as you set the context, like small company moving from hardware to software, like all of those details that you gave, like, yes, I really want to know about the metrics and I'll be listening for that. But I really like that there's a narrative there. You know, here's why we had to do this and we had to do it in a big fat hurry. Here's why we had to do it in a hurry. It's particularly impressive that you paid a lot of attention to metrics when you had to do this in a hurry. So basically, I'm saying it's a story I'd like to hear.
I agree with that. It's also, people are gluttons for punishment and they love to hear about failure and how you've like risen from the ashes to succeed. Or even if you didn't succeed in the way that you thought you did and you had to completely pivot. People love that type of like, it was so awful, it was the worst, but you know what, we figured out how to get through it, because it's such a human thing, and everybody fails. And so probably if you take that slant to a degree, you're going to have a lot of people coming up to you being like, oh man, we had to do something similar and it didn't really turn out that way. So it was really encouraging to hear someone else struggle through it who figured out a way to like turn it into some glory, or just like who got through it, because it's the getting through that really appeals.
Rose, wouldn't you say that it's more common to hear conference talks that are about like this really successful, awesome thing we did, as opposed to this crash and burn that happened?
You can, so here, I will give you an example. So my mom, she ended up doing an undergraduate like thesis, and during her thesis, she disproved her foundation, her abstract, or whatever it's called. I'm terrible with words because it's the end of my day. And everybody was like, oh, you know, you can take another year and you can redo all of this research and it'll be fine. You'll find something that you quote succeed at. And she's like, you know what? I'm done, because I have helped someone else take one step further to doing better next time. And just because like you succeeded and you were awesome and you got all the glory the first time, like I don't actually think I've met somebody who hadn't tripped and fallen, shall we say, before like figuring out how to better succeed. Not that I don't like success stories, but I think it's the hubris that gets me a lot of the time. And that could just be 100% preferential. Like I will cop to that. So.
I wanted to
the way to take, I think the way to take Rose's point to a potentially more sort of broader reaching proposal or talk is to frame it as failure points, right? I mean, because if you're shipping docs at a certain point, and like the story that you just told us, you know, you got to shipping docs, right? Whether you wound up with quite the metrics that you hoped for as you were planning for them or not, that's a whole nother story. You never do, actually, right? And that's, I mean, it's really interesting to talk about those differences and how you account for those differences. That in and of itself is a kind of success story, right? So it's partly about framing the pieces of the story, right? Here's what we tried to do that didn't work, but here's the information. Note that I do not use the term data here. Here's the information that we got out of that failure point and what we did with it as we move to the next point, right? I guess I'm kind of putting together Rose's feedback with what I heard you describing, Kimberly, in your initial story.
Thank you. It's helpful.
I guess just like some feedback that I think would be really interesting to learn about more too is that last bullet point you mentioned about the how to decide like what to take out of the guide, just because I kind of run into the problem sometimes where I put so much into something that it's just not helpful because you know, there's too much information.
Definitely be one of the hardest parts. Thank you.
This is Danny. I think that you've got something that could really spur on a lot of additional conversations if you just talk about metrics. If you were to talk about what the metrics that you give, like 3 examples, and why some failed and why some succeeded, it actually sets other people up for success to copy this in what they're doing. You may actually be able to sustain, you know, something that has gone, like that can be compared to other teams in open source or across your company. And I wonder if that might actually be a nice way to limit your topic so that you really dig in your 30 minutes.
I'll think about that. Thank you. So limiting to just the metrics and examples.
Yeah, to add to what Danny said, I've been waiting for somebody to do a metrics talk, and I would really love to see somebody kind of interview the people who participate in the analytics channel on the Slack, the Right to Doc Slack, and kind of get best practices and, you know, congeal everything into a talk that could apply to different situations, maybe compare and contrast how different teams have done things. And maybe that's a totally different talk idea, but
Well, we're starting to get to the point where the conversation is going into awkward silences. So I don't know if anybody else has feedback for Kimberly, but I think we're ready to go to proposal number 5. And since I find myself liking to see people's faces, I'm not going to screen share since all I have is Swapnil's name. And I know Swapnil's joining us from Australia, and I will make him the host if he has slides to share.
Actually, I don't have any slides, Mike,
Okay.
but thanks so much. It's pretty early days. Like it's, I've literally had this thought this morning. Like I was on a chat with my manager and another documentation writer, tech writer. So I've started at a new organization a couple of months back, but it's sort of a mixed role. So I'm writing documentation, but I'm also interacting with the community. So it's more like a tech writer relations advocate role. And it's this idea is like literally a seed at this moment, so I don't even know if there's enough, you know, material there. I'm hoping to get some, you know, sort of feedback from other people here, whether it can actually develop into a proposal. So to provide a bit of a context, what our product, which is it's an API documentation product. It does a whole lot of other things, but primarily a lot of this is using people's open APIs and converting them into a developer portal or reference documentation, and it's all sort of tied in together. We do linting and everything on the product on open API definition files, and once that's sort of set up, it goes into reference docs and developer portals. So everything just sort of sits coupled nicely together. This morning I was having a chat with my manager, and he said there's a lot of customers that are asking us that they're really impressed with the product. That's not an issue. It's the thing is when they start working on the documentation aspect of it. So when they start working on the reference docs or the developer portal, the thing that they get stuck with is not necessarily businesses or organizations or developers themselves, but technical writers who could be working at these organizations. What they get really stuck into is there is no user interface or a content management system that allows them to create the documentation. So, and I'll only provide that much context because the idea then germinated from there is a lot of technical writers in the past have worked with some sort of a user interface. So it could be a help authoring tool like Madcap Flare or RoboHelp or something like that, or could be a CMS like Contentful, or, you know, even working with customer support or knowledge base software like Zendesk or something like that, or Intercom. And they're sort of used to looking at a user interface and then creating documentation based on it. And then there's the other on the other side of this whole spectrum are the developers or people who are pretty comfortable working with in docs as code approach and working with just pure text and then rendering them into documentation. So it's a bit of a, from my sort of experience, there are two types of sort of tech writers. Some who are happy with the user interface and they want to work in that sort of specific environment. And then there's technical writers or people who come, I use the word technical writers, but it's anyone who pretty much, you know, does documentation within the organization. They're comfortable working with Markdown or docs as code approach, and they're pretty happy doing that. So there's these two people, and there's some sort of a wall in between from experience where people from the UI side of things don't want to jump into Markdown. And once you're into Markdown, you're sort of reluctant using the user interface because you know you can do a lot more things in Markdown, and the collaboration with developers sort of just, you know, ramps up exponentially. So the talk idea was literally how do technical writers or people who document get over that fear factor of working with something like Markdown or docs as code. I know it's a very basic idea, but is there anything that can come out of that idea in terms of a proposal? Is there, like, you know, things that we can educate people who haven't worked with Markdown before to get over that fear factor? Sometimes I just find technical writers are reluctant because they think, oh, I might be working in Markdown in a repository that the developer is using, and I might break some product code or something, and the whole system crashes. So, is there any idea that a proposal that can come out of this idea?
So I'd like to jump in because I worked at Juniper on a project where I was it was, you know, Swagger to Markdown. We were using Swagger to Markdown. Actually, it was my proposal that got them to use Swagger to Markdown in order to, anyway, as I got involved in that process, then with the team, I was working with many of the people wanted to learn about lightweight markup languages and about, you know, so that they could get a little more involved. Working directly with development teams. And in addition, those of us that had experience with Git started teaching other writers there how to use Git. And so we came up with an idea of just enough Git. And if you'd like to collaborate, or if you'd just like to even just you give the talk, I would be happy to take a little more of the discussion offline and just give you some benefit of the experience that I had teaching. You know, I don't have to be the one giving, you know, co-presenting or anything. I can just give you some information that you can feel free to take part of the story. You don't have to mention Juniper. But just, you know, I just think it's a really powerful idea. And I would really like to help more writers understand it's really not all that hard if you take the approach of learning just enough Git as a start. You know, it's like let's because you don't have to, as a writer, you don't, you know, whatever. I have a whole lot of points I can make, and you probably have some of those already, but you've just really intrigued me, and I'd love to help.
Okay, thank you. I think that was Alyssa, wasn't it? Yeah, I'll just make a note
Release
of that.
Sawyer, yeah, I can type my, I trust everybody here, so, you know, here's I'll just type my information in so you have it.
Okay, thank you.
This is Stelliana. I just wanted to provide my feedback also. I'm actually thinking of presenting a proposal on Dox's code, building it from scratch, because that was my experience with it. I actually work as part of a development team, and I can't imagine, you know, using any other strategy to maintain documentation. And what you said about, you know, having that divide between technical writers, some that utilized, you know, the Dox's code approach, and the other side, it really resonated with me, because I don't ever want to abandon the Dox's code approach. I think it's very beneficial being a part of a development team and having those resources to directly, you know, go to for information. And actually, technically, I'm a part of the QA team, but overall, I'm a part of the development team. So having those resources when new features come out and I can like test them, and I have access to all the tools, and they include me in that process. And it's very nice to actually be able to work in that collaborative environment with engineers and to be trusted, you know, to understand that information. So it really, really resonated with me. And I think there would be value, you know, to kind of, I don't know, highlight some of those benefits to people, I guess.
Okay, thank you.
I had one thought about people kind of transitioning from one group to the other, that I think if you're in a WYSIWYG type environment, but you have the ability to toggle to like a source code view, whether it's my Madcap Flare or even Dida has some user interfaces that you can then toggle to just see the bare XML. Like learning how to troubleshoot using those more technical view is a good way, that's like a gateway to becoming more familiar and confident in those types of interfaces.
I think that's a brilliant point, Rachel. I've never worked in a data authoring tool that didn't require me at some point to troubleshoot the raw XML. And if you can do that, you're fine working with pretty much anything in Access code, right? So I think when I was listening to you talk, Swapnil, I was thinking, like, you posited this as a great divide. There are the users of the WYSIWYG tools, and then there are the users of the code tools. And, you know, like Rachel's idea is what Rachel said is helping me articulate that maybe the thing to do is not posit it as a great divide, but talk about the gateway drugs to, you know, like, if you're working with a WYSIWYG tool, chances are that there's more going on that you're interacting with under the superficial WYSIWYG hood that maps to Dox's code than you might think ahead of time. If you're really like used to a WYSIWYG tool, which I think most technical writers worth their salt really aren't at a certain point. We always have to poke under the hood. We always have to dig a little deeper to understand what's going on, whether it's in the tools that we use or the functionality that we're documenting. And I'm going to stop now because I could keep going forever at this point.
Actually, so this is Nicola. I will kind of bounce off that last comment. So I was working at a large company for a while. We were in DITA, and I actually had to help an acquisition move from FrameMaker to DITA because that's what we had funding for. So you can probably guess what company it was. And so we had mathematicians, we had business analysts, and we had technical writers all having to learn this stuff. And there were varying degrees of acceptance and varying degrees of acceptance of working in plain text as opposed to a WYSIWYG environment. So we actually were using Oxygen, and having that flexibility to go between the plain text view and varying degrees of showing tags was really helpful. And then along the lines of just enough Git, like I provided education on sort of just enough DITA. We were pretty lenient on how we had the SMEs, you know, write their docs and conform to two types of information. So we kind of provided some compromise and sort of met them where they needed to be. So we said, you know, what do you need? Well, I need to be able to write this stuff. I need to be able to write formulas. So, you know, we investigated tooling, we created templates. I set up Jenkins so that doing builds was really easy and had a graphical front end. So you find ways to kind of bridge that space so that you can meet a range of needs, because there were some people who were like, I want to write everything in plain text and don't give me an interface. And we had people who said, I want to see that plain text as little as possible. So I had to accommodate the whole range.
Sounds like you have a number of perspectives on the Great Divide or finding a way to gateway drugs. I don't know, Swapnil, if you need any more, but I think we want to get to as many proposers as possible.
No, I'm good. Thank you. Thanks for sharing your thoughts, everyone. Thank you.
Great. And next up, it's just checking my notes. I believe it's Rachel Stavensky. I hope I pronounced that correctly.
Pretty much. If I do have like a rough outline I could share if you're willing to make me the host for a bit.
Yep. Let's see. Find your name. It keeps moving around. Make host. Yes, you should now be host.
Thank you. Okay. So I know it's the end of a long day for me, so I have to look at something written in order to actually think clearly right now. So my proposed title is Shuffle Ball Change, Sashay Your Way to Clear API Documentation. It's a little bit silly, but there's something that happened to me many years ago where I was in a musical theater workshop and there was going to be a master class with Gregory Hines.
And I knew this girl who like wasn't a very good tap dancer, but she just like went out there and tapped her little heart out and got into this master class. And then like by the end of the class, like she was tap dancing with Gregory Hines, like no big deal. And I think the takeaway for me was really like, you don't have to have a master's degree in API documentation to add value to a company. And I think a lot of times people get into a place where they're just said, hey, our API docs need help. Or maybe the company doesn't even know that their API docs need help. And so I want to sort of take that as, and mostly talk about API reference documentation, but to give some context for the different types of documentation, and then the benefits of being somebody who understands the way that a company's API works, so that if you're also working on UI-based documentation or even the UI strings in the app, if it's running on the API, understanding the way that that API works helps you write clear UI text as well. So my thought was I've worked at a few different places on APIs, and I had different ways of working to improve the docs at each place I was working. So for example, one, they had like a million different microservices, but we had one that was really key. And so I had this giant spreadsheet, and I worked to refine all of the descriptions and just started there. So that's kind of high level. I've also worked where like the writer really owns the API spec and is carefully crafting it while testing in Postman. I've also worked where you're following up on the commits that people are putting into the repo and just editing code comments. And then most recently, I worked to establish some API guidelines for backend developers who are working on creating the API. So I was going to go into the details of basically how I created these guidelines and how we're workshopping them at Netlify to help the API documentation move forward. So I was thinking, you know, for documentarians that are feeling shy about delving into API documentation, but also people who are currently working at API docs, just to kind of compare notes on processes. And so I guess my questions for the group are, is this useful enough information for people to share at a conference? You know, what, I feel like it's kind of like, well, duh, to some degree. And if it is, that's fine. But so that's my basic question, I would say.
I just put this in the chat, but absolutely yes. I'm one of the Slack moderators, and every week we have hordes of, well, okay, horde is an exaggeration, but it's late my time too, and I have a tendency to hyperbole. People who are interested in getting started in API docs, and they're like, okay, they know there's this open API spec thing, and they talk in all sorts of different ways about how they interact with it, how they interact with engineers, how the engineers interact with the API, with the spec. And you talk about like a larger context and ways of understanding things. Go for it.
Thank you.
I want to second that also, because we're at a point, we have several APIs and the documentation, it's kind of there, but we need to do a much better job. And when you talk about guidelines, I'm assuming those are guidelines for how to actually document, like for the developers, how to document the APIs. Is that, am I understanding?
Yes,
okay.
yes. So they have, for example, the current REST API, they are doing code comments next to the code. And so it's guidelines for them to know how to structure those comments and what to include, and very, very clear guidelines on what for them to do. And then we act as reviewers to ensure that the guidelines are being followed.
Yeah, I would be super interested in this as well.
Thank you.
So I just have a little thing to add that is sort of one of my pet things to mention to managers, is that as a writer, as I go in and I edit developer comments, for the API documentation, then the developers themselves see what I've done, and whether they get angry or not, they start improving their writing because this pesky writer, correcting something that they've done sometimes irritates them. And other people feel like, oh, this helpful writer, really improves something. It doesn't matter which way they're going, one way or another, they actually improve their writing in the process because they're seeing it right in their code.
I also want to call out something you said that really, really speaks to me. I've actually been making noise about this in various corners for these many years now, which is API review. Because if it's hard to document, chances are the solution is not in the documentation, right? So maybe that's a whole nother talk. I seem to be proposing lots of extra talks for people tonight. But I think there might be some value in pointing that out in this talk too. Don't know, just a thought, a thing I'm like really, really seriously into.
I just put in a comment, Rachel, in the chat about, this is the kind of information I would have really loved to see when I started writing API docs. So something like I actually raised a question in the Write the Docs Slack the other day about who actually owns the API spec or the open API definition files. And there's some interesting conversation there. So yeah, definitely thumbs up. This is a really good proposal.
Thank you. I feel like there's a lot of information that's out there about the tooling and how to do things technically, but sometimes it's not really about the tooling, it's about the words.
About the words, and as Swapnil says, about the ownership, right? I mean, the different ways that you describe sort of managing the words also reflect really different workflows, really different approaches to actually developing the API itself, right? If you're maintaining a spreadsheet, what on earth is going on in the code? I don't want to think, right? Or as a docs teammate said to me at a company that shall remain nameless, if this is how they manage docs, I don't like to think about what the code is like. When it comes to API docs, ideally things are pretty tightly coupled, and the less coupled they are, the more manual. Although, again, at a certain point, it has to be manual because somebody has to write those description strings, right? Which is a lot of your point. And again, I could go on forever, so I'm stopping now.
Thank you, everybody. I appreciate the insights.
I love this, how Meetup all of a sudden seems to run itself and I don't have to jump in or prompt anybody. But it sounds like Rachel has a great proposal and has gotten good feedback on how to improve it. And we're getting on to proposal number 7. Falon Darville, I hope I pronounced that correctly. Let's see, I don't know if that I have sharing.
Fallon Darville, yeah.
Yes, thank you. Rachel, if you can make Fallon the host if she has slides or anything like that.
No slides.
Okay, then just go ahead and tell us what you have in mind.
Okay, great. So this is basically a case study about how I drove a docs culture as a solo technical writer in a team of 70 engineers. So I kind of wanted to talk about what it's like being thrown in the fire and how to cultivate a docs culture when nobody's paying too much attention to docs. So when I started at my current company, we had almost no documentation, and now we have 3 separate websites that I built and all of the docs that came from that. So I would be talking about basically why some docs are better than none, which is kind of necessary to talk about in a startup environment. How I got people involved in building out dozens of docs over 3 sites. How to become comfortable with unfinished documentation, because there's a fixation oftentimes on, well, if we can't just do it all now, why do it at all? How I've been able to establish partnerships with engineers, how I kind of found my place within the org as our only technical writer and as kind of like a position that's not always regarded as part of the engineering team. And then how I started just a tech guild where I could speak more with individual contributors as opposed to always listening to what managers would prefer to see. I think it's very important to democratize documentation. And then finally, I've kind of alluded to this, but being part of the engineering team and having highly technical skills myself and how that plays into my relationship with the other engineers.
I would like to chime in if that's okay. I really love this idea as well because I feel the same. I am the only technical writer on the team, and we didn't have any type of documentation solution when I started, and I feel like I've struggled with a lot of the same things, and I think I would find a lot of value in this type of presentation, like case study, just to kind of see how you were able to kind of wrangle everybody in. You talk about democratizing, you know, everybody kind of, I think it becomes organic if you do a good job. Like you eventually start to pull people into the process and everyone starts to cooperate, but sometimes it can get frustrating because it can take a while to get to that point. So I think that would be a really good talk as well.
I think it would appeal to a broader audience than folks who are sole writers too. Plenty of us have worked on teams or work on teams with similar or even worse ratios, right? So I just came from a team of about 10, and we worked with somewhere in the vicinity of 1,500 engineers. So same sorts of problems. I mean, I think startup land and creating a docs culture is a specific issue that you're describing, and I don't want to suggest that you back off from that. Only that the cultivating the culture thing can speak to a bigger audience too. It's a both and, not an either or. Also, I love the getting comfortable with incomplete.
Yeah, that's
yes.
an important one.
Well,
yes, I agree.
That links back to Alyssa's talk about open source documentation, where you've always got to be satisfied with incomplete, with imperfect. What's a style guide even? Let alone, I mean, like technical incompleteness.
I wanted to add, it sounded like you were saying you were the first technical writer hire for this organization. Is that right?
So they had a previous technical writer, but that technical writer left after like, I think 3 months, and I just took over from there, and I've been there for since the last one. When I came in though, it was just basically the way I described it. It was just kind of scattered like Google Docs and like one API guide. So I've been able to like build on that through trying to motivate people to care about documentation.
I do think it's a pretty common scenario when somebody gets hired in as either the first technical writer or, in your case, the second one after a 3-month blip, and it's kind of an intimidating landscape. So I think, to me, emphasizing that aspect of it would appeal to me as a talk listener.
It's intimidating, yet also there are opportunities to set a standard, if you will. And I think that's something that is attendees love hearing, hey, you know what, you might be the first, you might be scared like a deer in headlights, but at the same time, you get to set a baseline standard.
Absolutely, yeah.
Just want to verbalize a thought of on a title, a roadmap for a solo documentarian, and I say documentarian in that that's the term we like to use at Write the Docs, as our audience is only about half technical writers. We go beyond that. Nevertheless, I think this is a great topic. Being a solo documentarian that has lessons for that anybody can learn from.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I don't know if people are getting tired or have other thoughts for Fallon, and I know there are people. Okay, go ahead, Mo.
One heads reminder for to Write the Docs. Historically, there has been many attendees who identify themselves as quote unquote lone tech writers or lone writer in their organization. So you will have a built-in audience. Just want to let you know that. I'm one of those people too.
They call me the one-woman wolf pack at my job, so it'll be great to meet others like.
Make sure you mention that in your presentation. Keynote.
Oh yeah.
I love that. The one-woman wolf pack. That's great.
I know 90 minutes is about the time when people start getting tired at meetups, but there are a lot of great people here and a lot of great comments. I don't know if Danny, was it you, Danny, who wanted to also present an idea, or was there anybody else? I forget.
Yeah, I would love to. If it'll be really fast, I just put some basic slides in the chat. If it's okay to just riff for a minute.
Go for it.
Are you okay? Is it Eliza or Alyssa?
Oh yeah, no problem.
Okay, good. So my main question here is whether or not this is an appropriate audience. My name is Danny Fair, and I have been an operations lead and had a really difficult time trying to bridge that gap between non-technical and technical communications. And so what I wanted to address in a short talk was, and is, this idea of writing to be understood instead of just explaining. So talking about neuro-inclusion as a core competency and a leadership style as a documentarian. How do you set teams up for success to understand each other, where we might be just kind of sticking with a standard or a consistent way of writing that doesn't actually inform new teams or different types of thinkers. So I'm not sure if everyone can see the slide deck. Yes, no?
Yes.
I can see it fine, yes.
Oh, okay, great. So basically my TLDR, or the general purpose here, is just that you need to have a suite of inclusive writing strategies so that people are oriented around being understood rather than simply explaining. Because when we just look at what technical writing or dev teams are doing, it's not followed by the rest of the organization. And we're seeing in worlds where there are no documentarians, it's not even being, there isn't that baseline for to follow. So the idea of this session would just be to identify some limits in typical writing and communication standards and tinker with a few templates that I have and encourage some discussion on this, whether or not they're useful and how they might be improved upon. So with that, if we go over to, I'll put the link in the chat here to get to the tools themselves. That's all right. It is, let's see, neuroinclusion.io. Inclusion.io. And I just put that in the chat. I realize it's not actually hyperlinked because of that problem. Can anyone get to that site?
I'm there.
You are? Okay, cool. So if you go into the drop down on the upper right, you'll see tools. Go ahead and click that. And the main focus I wanted to do is to have people actually play around there. I realized since I am not able to share my screen, that was a flaw in my process here. If you will let me share, then I could open it up. Otherwise,
let's see, I forget who has the host right now, but if you can give that.
I think I passed it to Falon.
Okay. Falon, do you have the host? And
I am not the host. Or
I think you may have the
Oh.
ability to pass it
yeah.
along.
Okay.
if you can choose Danny and let's see, Warlink, I think it was.
Okay, done.
Danny, do you have access?
great. So I can go ahead and share the neuroinclusion site. I'm doing this all from my phone, and so I'm afraid this is causing more problems. So let's see.
We're able to access the link that you shared in the chat.
Oh, good, good, good. Okay, great. So basically, if you go into that, you'll see some of the tools that I've built, and it's not really clear if this is the appropriate place for, again, I'm just gonna undo this because my phone is not cooperating. I have an Android and it's not showing me what I need to see. Okay, so this is all debugging for when we do this online and we are remote, I think.
I guess the question I have is how can a documentarian or technical writer or whomever actually use lessons from neuroinclusion in our work?
Well, that's the whole point here. So it's that we have this, we make a lot of assumptions about what is understood based on language, like we've mentioned before in this talk, and also on communicating needs for additional resources to executives, also to sales teams that are over-promising, may not necessarily, any sort of outreach to developers outside of a company. So when you're looking at how to be as effective as possible, a lot of times people they don't have any baseline of understanding outside of your own specific team. And so this is a unique way of looking at how to display information and get some basic understanding of everyone's way of thinking in order to best communicate. So some of the templates that are on there, you'll see there's one that talks about decision making based on to sort of surface unconscious bias. There's another template in that tool site that talks about worker profiles. So it's this very rudimentary, or maybe it's just an overarching topic that addresses this at scale, communicating so that you know what you're saying is being understood, and doing it in a way that sort of normalizes the differences in folks that might be on the autism spectrum, have ADHD, might only be able to really communicate in visual, or really understand the things they see versus the things they hear. So I'm open. I would love to hear your feedback. If you don't think this is the right audience for this, then that's cool. I just wanted to tap into such a effective community with Write the Docs, and I wasn't sure if this was appropriate.
Whoops. I have a couple of follow-up questions along
Absolutely.
the line, like intended to help address your question, right?
Sure.
Because just, okay, like I've spent all of a couple of minutes exploring the site, so I don't really have a sense of what the resources are like, but my very quick skim suggests that there are resources that are designed more for more two-way interaction.
Yeah.
And when you're creating documentation, this is one of the reasons why documentarians are so obsessed with analytics, right? It's one of the few ways that we have of getting a sense of what reception of our work might be like. Why there's often chatter on the Write the Docs Slack about feedback widgets, because, oh my God, if like users are gonna like give us feedback, we want that. But it's not the same. And I mean, I would dearly love to see the kinds of issues that the neurodiversity resources are trying to address, like translated into the more, not entirely, but more sort of one-way communication that documentation has to struggle with.
Yeah.
I don't know whether you feel like ready to undertake that translation effort. I think it would be really awesome if you were, or if you could even just sort of imagine what the possibilities might be like. One of the things that I think a lot of professional documentarians like struggle with is how to write approachable documentation that can reach a global audience. And that feels
exactly.
like really close, like really like this close to the neurodiversity issue, right? Because so much of that is culturally defined. It's not,
absolutely, yeah.
It's not inherent, right? It's all about how narrowly, okay, another soapbox.
Yeah, no, I think we're right in the same
narrowly
page,
we define normal, right? And sort of how constrained we make our communication because we think it all has to happen one way. So I think that there's just tremendous potential here. And I guess I think I'm going to stop. Go.
No, I appreciate that. That makes me feel like I'm not just shooting in the dark here. I think where, because of the limits and I'm not at home, I'm legitimately parked in a casino parking lot trying to like connect here. There is a matrix I built called the Waldo matrix, which is basically something that will explain where you go for what, at what stage are you in this doc, who's allowed to edit, who's allowed to comment, and where it's kept. And it's, if you go into that, the tool worksheet, I can send you the link later, but it basically is what I want to propose as something that can be used by any team to explain where you go to find our guts, the things that we're doing, and who's allowed to edit and how. Once it's been approved, then no touchy, like it gets moved to another location to avoid this idea of so many drafts that are not to be used. And so when I was working at a very large, upsettingly large company, they just had tons and tons of drafts and everyone was editing past drafts and nobody was killing anything. No one was deleting anything. And there was no, like, I was able to actually get rid of about 30% of their of of their SharePoint requirements. So basically, that's not big, but it was enough to prove that they had so much redundancy, and it was only hurting them because no one had the most clear information possible. So being very clear about where things go when they're done, and then being able to have that doc hygiene, I think, is important. So that was the exemplar I was going to walk people through to see if it's of any use.
So I would emphasize that example in the abstract, because now we're starting to talk about internal documentation processes. And that's something that's really core to all communities, whether or not it's open source, of how do you create and streamline and control, the information inside of your company. And it is a type of documentation. And I almost want to call it control alt delete, because you're trying to control and you are removing the alternative options for drafts, and you're deleting, what doesn't serve you.
I like it a lot. And I think that that gives me something to go home and edit. And if I just focus on the Waldo matrix, or this thing that I created, I think that that will allow people to see that you do not need to, it's really platform agnostic. So people do not, I love it. I love it. That's great. For the subject on the chat. So, okay, cool. That sounds good. I'll iterate and hopefully have something that stands the sniff test.
Sweet.
Sounds wonderful. We've had a lot of, Danny, it sounds like you have direction.
I do. I gotta run because I'm still in the parking lot. So thank you all very much.
See you, Danny.
Bye. Bye.